Well, welcome to Summer Fishtrap Day 3 already. It's, although none of us are sure exactly what day it is. I've heard rumors it's Wednesday. So thank you for joining us again for another one of our featured faculty readings. I am super excited. I think you know this, but Omar, I think you've known this. I met you briefly at Wordstock a few years ago. Our friend Luis Urrea introduced us, and he brought me over and he says, "You two need to meet each other." And we met really briefly, and I was, you know, anytime Luis says you guys need to meet, you take that seriously. And I bought your book that day. And this, don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I bought your book that day and brought it home, and I think read it over the course of the weekend, and it's been around with some friends. So I very quickly became a fan. And then when Mike and I were talking about Summer Fishtrap in the future, would, you know, your name just automatically just popped right up there. So you can thank or blame Luis Urrea for this, but I'm very, very excited both for Fishtrap and personally that you've agreed to go on this adventure. And the airplane goes by. Life in the country, huh? So I'm very grateful to have you join us this year. I hope it's been it's been an inside experience for you, but hopefully we'll change that in years to come. So,
well, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor. I'm missing that cabin desperately, but I will definitely take you up on a future offer.
Yeah, we'd love to have you out. So Omar, for those of you who don't know, I didn't know this when we met, but your background is largely in journalism. So if you've read his bio, you can see that Omar's done work for, my gosh, I'm looking at this right now for with The Guardian and Le Monde and Guernica and you know, just all over the place. So your novel American War, which I highly, highly recommend, is an international bestseller, has been translated into 13 languages. How many of those languages do you speak? I'm curious.
1.5.
Okay.
I managed to proofread the Arabic version, so I was pretty proud of that.
It won the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Award, an Oregon Book Award for Fiction, the Kobo Emerging Writer Prize, and has been nominated for more than 10 other awards. It is a wonderful read. He's one of 25 readers featured in the new anthology of speculative fiction, People's Future of the United States, and you live in my home stomping grounds, Portland, Oregon. Welcome. We're excited to hear you read.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you all for showing up to this. It means a lot. I went back and forth on what to read. Usually there's a kind of weird, like vicious cycle of time deflation, inflation at readings with writers, where the conference organizers want people to read for 8 minutes, but they know what writers are like, so they'll say read for 2 minutes, knowing that they're going to go 8 minutes, and then it just gets worse every year. And I rarely get a 20-minute chunk. At first, I was going to read something very, very different from what I usually do. You may not know this if you have any experience with my personality or utter lack of charisma, but I used to write comedy back in the day. And recently I wrote a piece that was set to be performed at a New York theater troupe thing. And it was the first piece of comedy I'd written in a long time. And since this is an incredibly depressing time, I thought maybe that would make sense to do it here. But I looked at the contract, and they have the right of first performance, and I can't afford to give them back their $150. So that's off the table. Almost everything else I write are just stone cold bummers. So you're going to get one of those today, and I apologize in advance. I was going to do something for my new novel, which comes out summer of next year. But we were talking in the workshop this morning, and I referenced this short story that I wrote a while back, and I think I'll do that one. So this is a short story I wrote for something called the Short Story Advent Calendar, which comes out yearly around Christmas time. It's an Advent calendar, and every day is a story, and it's going to be republished in an anthology later this year. It takes place in a world where what you need to know is there's a metal. They discover this metal, and they find that it has this property where if you make an airtight box out of this metal, you mark it with your DNA, with your blood, and you put something inside, they find that the moment you die, the thing inside disappears. And so it is believed, but not known with any real certainty, that it follows you. Whatever you put in there follows you into the afterlife. Fast forward, and the story takes place at the government slots. The government slots is a post office type building. Every US citizen gets a small slot that they can put something in. So the story takes place in these sort of government issued afterlife boxes. So the story itself is called Government Slots. I think that's all you need to know. Let's do this. 3 brown dahlias, pressed and dried, a photograph of a meadow in spring, a compass. In the morning, just after we open, an old woman comes in. She stands in line. There's always a line, though never a long one, and she passes through the metal detector without setting it off. It's Christmas Day, and we are, as far as I can tell, the only state or federal building open. We're open every day. You never know. The old woman makes her way past security and over to the ticket spitter. She takes a number and sits down on one of the gray plastic chairs bolted to the floor. She waits until a man at one of the inspection desks calls her number. Then she stands, removes her paperwork from her handbag, and shuffles over. Without speaking, the man takes her papers: identification, social security, proof of ownership. He looks through them, disinterested. The old woman waits. Finally, the inspector sets the paper aside. From a desk drawer, he retrieves a blank deposit form. All right, he says, let's see what you got. The woman reaches into her purse and pulls out a small sandwich bag full of cloud white fur. She slides it across the table. The inspector picks up the bag, cautious, with the tips of his thumb and his index finger. He stares at it as a jogger might stare at roadkill, repulsed but not repelled, curious about the insides of things. A dog? The inspector asks. Bichon frisé, the woman replies. That's a dog? Yes. The inspector starts to say something, then sighs and waves to one of his colleagues at the next desk. His colleague comes over and he too picks up the bag, turns it over in his hand, holds it against the light. Dog fur, the inspector says. His colleague nods, then shakes his head. Not allowed, he says. Nothing perishable, nothing alive. This isn't perishable, the old woman replies. This isn't alive. Both inspectors look at each other, and when one shrugs and shakes his head again, the other does the same. Sorry, they both say, almost in unison. This is usually the point where there'd be a fight, when the customer would demand to see a manager or start threatening lawsuits. Sometimes security gets involved, sometimes things get undignified. But the old woman does none of this. Carefully, she puts the bag of fur back in her handbag and walks away. Look, if you want, you can go around to the office and ask for an exemption, one of the inspectors says to the old woman as she leaves. But she doesn't turn, doesn't acknowledge him. He looks ashamed and annoyed to feel ashamed, the way all men do when they're forced to look at the underside of their boots. The old woman leaves. I watch her disappear into the blue December light. Then I go back to mopping. It's important we keep the floors clean at the government slots. People get upset if the floors aren't clean. An endorsement letter signed by a cardinal. A miniature compendium of prayers for the dead. A pack of condoms. You're taught in school that it was an oil speculator who found it. Somewhere out in southwest Arizona, where now they've got a museum and a gift shop, but you can't get within 10 miles of the mine without a written permission and an armed escort. In winter, the wrens swirl around the place, little black dollops of life against the endless flush-red land. It was an accident. The speculator was busy tearing the ground open with dynamite and pressure pumps. One day the dust clears, and what he sees at the bottom of the crater is this purple-gray metal, shards of it everywhere. It's softer than it looks, but not malleable by hand. It's light, but not too light. He doesn't know what to make of it, what value it might have. He takes a sample to a friend of his, a physicist and metallurgical engineer. He leaves it with her for a few days, and when he comes back, she's still staring at it, dumbfounded. He asks her what it's made of, and she says nothing anyone's ever seen before. It's a new square on the periodic table, the insides of its atoms at once indecipherable and coherent. For years, there's great excitement, mostly in academic circles. There's a naming ceremony, a slew of papers published in Nature and Science. But what the speculator wants is a commercial use, and for a long time there is none. Save for its novelty, it offers nothing. Slowly, interest fades, even among researchers, and eventually it's only the metallurgical engineer who still dedicates herself to studying the metal. For the most part, her work comes to nothing, but one experiment yields unexpected results. The metal's fundamental physical properties change when it's made to form an enclosure, a closed space. From this finding, the engineer develops a theory about containment. She posits that a space enclosed by this metal has properties of superposition, and in this way, there's a place to which anything enclosed might travel, a distant but interlocked point on the other side of the universe, perhaps, or another universe altogether. She builds a small airtight box, and as an homage to her favorite physicist, she places a cat's collar inside. At first, she checks on it hourly, then daily, then once a month. She tries running a current through it, tries raising and lowering the temperature. She tests the metal's reaction to organic matter. She smears it with drops of her own blood. She subjects the thing to pressure, stress, violence. She almost burns her lap to the ground trying. Eventually, within certain academic circles, the engineer becomes a laughingstock of sorts. Her name is shorthand for futility. She retreats from the world. The cat's collar sits in the box for years untouched. Decades later, on her deathbed, she exhales for a last time, and in that moment, the friends and family assembled by her side hear a loud crumpling sound from her hallway closet, a sound like 100 bones snapping at once. When they check the closet, they find the box collapsed in on itself. They pry it open and find it empty. Hearing of this, the speculator remembers his friend's old theory about the metal as a conduit of passage. He is by now nearing death himself, a prosperous but strangely unfulfilling life behind him. He commissions the building of a similar box for himself and all the staff at his mining company. He marks his with a drop of blood, asks his staff to do the same. Some do, many refuse. He places a pocket Bible in his box. He keeps it by his bedside, and at the moment of his death, there comes the same crumpling. The Bible inside disappears. From such smallness, a universe is formed. 3 chocolate chip cookies, smuggled. A small plush unicorn, its horn half severed. A photo album titled, Your Grandchildren. What you get by law is a box the size of a fist. Everyone who can prove citizenship gets one, no different than a passport or the right to vote. Out here at the North Coast Station, we cover most residents in the 707 area code. They haven't split it up yet, and that makes us one of the biggest stations in the state, maybe the country. You can see it from miles away on the turnpike, this huge gray building that looks like a row of office towers laid on their sides. The bureaucracy sits in the building out front, a couple of offices where you can get your power of attorney forms approved, or appeal an inspector's decision, or get on a wait list as soon as a doctor signs a probable viable pregnancy form. Otherwise, it's just the after boxes, hallways and hallways, rows upon rows, a storehouse of all the things people believe will follow them into the next life. You can see the building from space, they say. It looks like fingers, like a hand reaching out. A tiny vial of blood, smuggled. A Swiss Army knife, 12 gold coins. Out in the hills, there's a billionaire with a box the size of a dozen airplane hangars. Inside, he's been building a facsimile of the neighborhood he grew up in and a facsimile of the estate he lives on now. He's building a grain silo and a water tower, a seed vault and a gun locker, a bunker and a stockpile of antibiotics. By law, the doors of the box must stay open while there are workers inside. A yearbook page. Not far from the original mine in Arizona, the cops found a cult commune, its members all gone but one. In a small cabin at the center of the ranch, the spiritual leader's assistant sat next to the leader's body, whispering a small chant of gratitude. On the other side of the property, outside a sealed, shack-sized box, they found a fading mandala in the sand and 100 pair of shoes. A recipe for bundt cake. If you drive a few miles south of here, into the Bay Area proper, you'll find the Green Hospice, where people go to die altruistically. Years ago, a technology baron donated money to build a box the size of a single-family home, and at all times, the box is filled with refuse, landfill trash, nuclear waste, contaminated material from the Superfund sites. Every time a resident of the Green Hospice is on the verge of dying, the box is marked with a sample of their hair or blood. And in dying, they rid the world of a small piece of its ugliness. The hospice is run by Orthodox Ascensionists. They believe the next world to be a place of infinite space and infinite grace, and so believe it a sin not to use one's death this way, as a cleansing rite. They post pictures of every deceased along with a picture of the garbage they take with them and a small note of thanks. Should everyone choose to die this way, they say, the world would be made significantly cleaner. Underwear. Last Christmas, the Supreme Court ruled against the assisted dying facility in Burlington. In the years since, all 54 petitioners in that case have died, only not together and not without pain. A bottle of aspirin, a Purple Heart, War and Peace in miniature print. Around noon, a woman and her son walk in. The boy is maybe 6 years old and too thin. There's a strange device strapped to his arm. It looks like a clear phone case, and there's some kind of liquid inside. A tube snakes from the case to a needle in the crook of the boy's arm. It appears painful, and he can't bend his arm, but he looks happy. It must be the case that sets off the metal detector, but the security guard waves the woman and the boy through anyway. The woman takes a number, but she doesn't get 2 steps towards the chair before an inspector calls her ahead of anyone else. And if anyone in the waiting area thinks this is unfair, they don't say it. The woman has all kinds of paperwork, but the inspector doesn't look at it. He smiles at the boy instead and asks him what he's got there in his hand. A transformer, the boy says. That's so cool, the inspector replies. The inspector leads the woman and her son down a hallway. I follow them, keeping my distance. I watch. The inspector opens an empty slot. Each slot sits atop a scale, and every time the weight drops for an instant to almost nothing, a little light on the slot's lid turns from red to amber to green. The inspector takes a gloved hand and makes a small show of pulling a single hair from the boy's head, pretends it's a magic trick of sorts. The boy laughs. The inspector places the hair in a tiny compartment within the slot's lid, and on the lid's digital screen, a check mark appears. I've seen this before. This isn't how it's supposed to be done. There are rules, procedures. It's all yours, the inspector says. He pushes the slot inwards, and it pops out, revealing the inner compartment. The boy gently tries to place his toy inside, but it won't fit. The inspector's face drops, but the boy says, "Hold on." Awkwardly, with one hand, he manipulates the toy, turns it from robot to car, and as a car, it just barely fits. The inspector says, "Yay," and the boy says, "Yay." And as the slot slides closed, the boy's mother breaks down crying. A scented candle, a wristwatch, a taser. There are protesters in the parking lot. It's a bigger crowd than usual. Usually we get them on Sundays and on Christmas Day, and today happens to be both. On one side of the lot, the Second Amendment people are demonstrating against the handgun ban. It's said the standard box size for a government slot was chosen specifically to be too small for guns. And I don't know if there's any truth to that, but in the years since, they've come up with smaller guns. So now there's a ban. It's not universal. None of the rules are. In New York State, you can't store anything that could conceivably be used as a weapon. Some folks have been turned away with their grandmother's sewing kit. In Delaware, you can put a grenade in if it fits. But here in California, you can't store guns. And every Sunday, someone's out in the parking lot protesting. On the other side of the lot is an assortment of the outraged devout. Every religion, it seems, has a branch or denomination that considers what goes on here heretical. They stop people on their way in, the same way members of the Forward Club do. But instead of trying to convince people to put the latest gadgets in their slots so as to keep the next life as advanced as this one, they try to convince them not to use the slots at all. If God exists, do you think these things will help you, they ask? And if God doesn't exist, do you think these things will help you then? Some people stop and listen. Most don't. It's hard to uppercase God in a place like this. Otherwise, it's quiet. The most excitement we get for the rest of the day is when a detective in a plainclothes show up with a warrant. I shuffle over to the hallway where the slot they're looking for is. I watch the guy from the law enforcement liaison's office turn the master key. The detective looks inside. It's empty. When did it clear? The detective asks. The liaison officer checks the paperwork. It never did, he says. It's always been empty. The detective curses. He hands the slot back to the liaison officer and walks off, the plainclothes following. Most people would never guess it, but almost all the government slots are empty. People rush to get on waiting lists for them, rush to stake their claim as soon as their children are born, sometimes even before their children are born. But they hardly ever get around to putting anything inside. There are books you can buy, seminars you can attend, a whole industry of advice on what to bring with you. But people just don't follow through. They die in car crashes and house fires and of sudden failures of the heart and of the blood, and they never believe such things are coming, and even if they did, it would make no difference. We weren't built to think this way, to imagine the else space of our lives. We don't know how not to know. Here, and I bet at every other center, most of the government slots are taken, and most of the government slots are empty. A memory stick full of movies and songs, a small jar of sand, a resume. We close early on Christmas Day. The inspectors and the security guards and the other janitors go home, a day's worth of time and a half pocketed. I stay to do the overnight clean. It's quiet at night. I like it when it's quiet. They make a sound, the boxes. It's a soft thing like breathing, and hardly anybody notices it. During the day, it hides behind the background noise of the place, the sound of people arguing, the beep of the metal detector, and the squeak of the soles against linoleum. But at night, you can hear it. It's the sound of air rushing in. When a box empties, it empties completely, and were it not for a small pneumatic hose attached to the bottom of each one, the slots would crumple in on themselves every time. The hose pumps air in, and the air wards off collapse. It's a sound like a sharp breath through the nostrils, a whispered leave-taking. A little after midnight, a young woman starts slamming her hands on the front doors. The sound is loud enough that I hear it from one of the hallways. She's yelling to be let in. I walk to the lobby to see what's going on, and I make the mistake of letting her see me. They come to the center after hours sometimes, and we're never supposed to let them in. We're supposed to ignore them, and if they get too violent, we're supposed to call the overnight guard. But I make the mistake of letting her see me, and once she does, she starts begging me to come closer, to just listen. I know it's a bad idea, but I walk towards her until I'm standing on the other side of the locked door. The evening sleet has made a mess of her. She waves papers at me, waves a key. He doesn't have time, she says, please. I can't help you, I reply. I hold my mop up to her as though it proves something. Then she screams at me. Not words, just a sound, an emptying. I don't know what to do. I take my key out, I open the door. She pushes past me, and as she does, she shoves a few sheets of paper at my chest. It's the usual stuff, photocopies of driver's licenses, a power of attorney, the expedited processing form any doctor will fill out for a couple $100. She runs down one of the hallways. I follow, watching. She stumbles, gets the wrong box at first, then the right one. I can tell it's pointless before she even turns the key. The light has already changed. But I don't tell her. I watch her open the box and I watch her look inside. I watch her fall to the floor. What's human about us is a burden, I think. I walk to where she is. The sound of the mop bucket's wheels against the ground seems for the first time obscene to me. I lift the bucket slightly, and within the walls, the whispered rush of nothings is once again audible. I set the bucket back down. I let the wheels squeak. She sits there vacant. She holds a chocolate cupcake half mashed in her hand. The inspectors would have never allowed it. I want to ask her a question, but I think I already know the answer. People die a long time before they're dead. So instead, I tell her the same trite thing I've heard a million times, the thing the counselors say to people who show up too late, people who waited too long, people who just didn't see it coming. You know, they have no proof, I say. Could just as easily be these things go nowhere. It could just be they disappear. Nobody really knows. She looks up at me and I think she's going to slap me. Instead, she laughs. You see that a lot too, people laughing. She smears the cupcake against the floor the way a smoker puts a cigarette out. She stands up and walks past me. She doesn't bother taking back her forms. Another thing you notice working here, they don't walk out the same way they walk in. If they show up confident, purposeful, they walk out looking at the floor. If they show up broken, they walk out with their heads held high. Something about this place does that to people. It inverts them. I dip the mop. I clean the mess she's left behind. There's a window at the end of each hallway, but the sleet has turned heavy and I can't see much outside. Thanks so much for your patience, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Omar, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. My gosh. Where did that come from, if I can ask? Is there something that
I mean, it's a good question. I don't have a good answer. I was thinking a lot about not knowing, right, and dealing with not knowing, and it came the core idea of like what if there were these boxes that carried things into the afterlife, and then what followed was months of me bugging everyone, my friends and family, of like, hey, if there was a box and you could put something in it and it would follow you to the afterlife, what would you put in? And nobody had a good answer because it was a silly question. Nobody had considered it before. But once that core idea came in, I was like, you'll notice the story has no plot really. It's sort of narrative, little vignette.
Mm-hmm.
I was far more interested in, you know, what would I put in there? I still don't have a good answer to that question. That was the draw of the story for me.
And it's interesting because for so many, who knows how many generations and how many cultures, that was something that was done, you know, buried with things that were important. I'm curious about your, and again, I'm going to let everybody know if you have questions, feel free to type them into the chat box and we'll happy to pass them on to Omar. What, you know, your background is in journalism. What got you into creative writing and specifically into speculative fiction?
Yeah, I mean, creative writing has been my home for a very long time. I'm one of those people who doesn't have a good answer to the question, where are you from? I was born in Egypt, but I grew up in Qatar. I'm a citizen of Canada. Now I live in the US. So fiction has been a refuge for me for a long time because you get to alter the contours of the made up world to fit whatever your experience is. I moved to Canada and I went to university. My degree's in computer science. I can't program my way out of a paper bag. I don't know why I picked computer science. It was a terrible idea. But I stopped going to class. I was so bad at it, and all I wanted to do was write. And then one day there was an ad in the student newspaper for, you know, they needed a reporter. So I interviewed for it. I got the job. I spent the next 4 years effectively forgetting about my education and getting an education at the student paper. And so I had a portfolio when I came out. And so I could working in journalism was a way to do something adjacent to what I wanted to do with my life. I could write, it wasn't fiction, but I could write and I could pay the bills writing. So I spent 10 years doing that, and I got one hell of an education. I got to go to places like Afghanistan. I got to go to Guantanamo Bay, and I could put a roof over my head. But I wrote fiction throughout. I wrote 3 novels before American War in my off hours as a journalist. None of them were any good, so I never tried to get them published or show them to anybody. But fiction was home long before journalism started paying the bills.
So along that line, I'm looking to see, there's Alexander, I think you just answered your question about which of your books would have a similar feel to this story. Is there anything else you would write to someone who, or recommend to someone who is looking for something, maybe one of your short stories or?
Yeah, I have one coming out in the literary journal Moss. It was supposed to come out in June, but I think everything's been pushed back. Mm-hmm. It's called The Memory Museum, and it's about a person who lives in a future where we've lost so much and tries to keep artifacts of what the present moment that we're in, the horns and antlers of species that no longer exist, books that can't be printed anymore, so it's a short about that. I mean, American War is speculative in the sense that it takes place 50 years from now, but is very much a book concerned with the past, things that have happened to people. And beyond that, I jump genre across short stories. I'm bad at a different thing every time. I choose a different thing to kind of mess up. Factory Air, a story that was in Guernica a while back, is speculative in the sense that it envisions a future in which we've run out of phosphorus, which we need for mass farming. Mm-hmm. Somebody has figured out how to make it synthetically. And so that person has quickly become the richest person on earth because they get a penny every time somebody buys a tomato. And it takes place in the factory and the horrific working conditions of what it looks like to keep the world fed and keep this guy being a trillionaire. Those come to mind, but really, they're pretty different each time, I think.
Lori wanted to know why you decided to write this in the present tense.
Really good question. I have these weird leanings when I go first person. I'm inclined to move into present tense for some reason. I don't know why. It just more often happens when I do that. I from the beginning envisioned it as a sort of a set of shorts, basically, each one broken up with a list of 1 or 2 or 3 things that people have put into their boxes, right? So, that kind of thing. And so it's easier for me. I'm not very good at holding first person or holding present tense for a full narrative, certainly not novel length and not really short stories either. So it was easier for me to stay in that mode because I was breaking it up so often, and I could go to beginnings again and kind of get a little refresh. So I think that's the reason why, but I'm not entirely sure.
Ma was curious about the world building process. So, as you were doing this, how did you create this? If you could talk a little bit more how you created the world for this particular story.
Yeah, this one was usually when I write, when I work on my novel length projects or anything big, anything that's likely to have a lot of moving gears, I tend to be really structured. I lean on my journalism background. So I have, it's not around here anywhere right now, but I have these big grids, chapter, what needs to happen, theme, characters, and it's very regimented to the point where it actually starts to kill off serendipity a bit. And I've had to kind of deliberately veer away from that because it gets a little too constrained. But for this one, I mean, I don't have these either, but it was written on the back of napkins and sort of like any paper I could find because I was constantly just writing down the things that could go in these boxes. That for me was like the central joy of constructing this story was just thinking of all the different things, going from like a Bible to a pack of condoms to a resume, like whatever people think the afterlife is going to be like and prepping for that was for me the most interesting part. And then once I had those, then I moved on to the computer, opened up a Word file, and worked backwards from the item to the wider policy implications, cultural resonance, whatever, you know, the thing that made up the vignette. But the opening planning salvo was really haphazard, just writing down things.
I'm really curious about the person who decides in their afterlife they should have their resume. That's they're thinking of a very different afterlife than I'm hoping I'll find. So if you have time for another question or two, are you okay? And again, my neighbor and the lawnmower, here we go. Christian wanted to know a little bit more about the generative process. Do you have a pattern for how and where your ideas come from? Is there something you sensed, or is it?
No, it's a really unsatisfying answer on my part, because what happens is that it's sort of, you work really hard to go down this road, and you work really, really, really hard at it, knowing that nothing is coming out of this road, knowing that for some reason, when you put all your efforts down this road, something is going to come out of that road, and it'll be the idea. You know, that was the case for American War. I spent years thinking about the world and thinking about the world building. What would a ruined South look like? All of this stuff. And then one day out of nowhere, the central character arrives unrelated to anything I'd been thinking about and kind of takes over the story. And so I'm sort of really reluctant to be like, follow my path, because my path is basically think really hard about the wrong thing, you know, because it'll turn out to be the wrong thing in the end. It'll turn out that some piece of inspiration is going to come from the side. And somehow the act of just thinking really hard about something, even if it's the wrong thing, somehow generates the idea that holds up the work. But it's a lot of time spent doing nothing. It's a lot of time taking like long car trips, long showers, laying in bed doing nothing. The preamble to the writing is a lot of just marinating in the world and taking the things as they come. It could be a narrative form. It could be, oh, this should be told in alternating chapters, right? That might be the thing. It could be a character description. It could be a sentence or a description of a place or something. And so I create a free-form notes file that I can put all of that stuff. That's the earliest stuff that shows up. And once there's a critical mass of that serendipitous, you know, haphazard world building, then I try to put it into a container. Then I try to put it into a grid of some form and be like, oh, this belongs early in the story. This belongs middle of the story. This belongs, you know, that kind of thing. But I don't know if that works for anybody else.
I apologize for the noise in the background. Now they've parked the lawnmower and is letting it idle. This is the other side of summer Fishtrap and the wonders. I'm going to ask this question from Ma because I had the same question. Actually, I wrote down. Our minds are in the same place. Did you read a lot of speculative fiction, you know, as you were younger? And were there people who influenced you or sources that you look to now that are influential in your work?
I mean, I did, but I didn't know I didn't know of the term, right? When I started reading this stuff when I was younger. And since American War has come out, I've had to read a lot more speculative fiction just so I can have a good answer to the questions, you know, what's your favorite speculative fiction? Because the book fits squarely in that definition, even though that wasn't the definition on my mind when I wrote it. Yeah, I mean, there's things that are part of the sort of Mount Rushmore that everybody talks about, and there's a reason everybody talks about 1984. The reason it keeps popping back into the zeitgeist. There's lesser known stuff. Earlier this morning, we were talking about examples of world building, and I brought up a book called Alas, Babylon by Pat Frank, which was published, I think, in 1959. I think he was a consultant to the US government on nuclear proliferation, and he was a guy who was terrified of the consequences of all-out nuclear war. And so he wrote this novel. Takes place in a small town in Florida, and a day, a few pages into the book, full nuclear war breaks out between the Soviet Union and US. The country's decimated, a bomb lands not too far from this town, and the rest of the book is just what daily life is like when society has broken down. You know, there's a river, but be careful, the water might be contaminated. You're bartering now, there's a town square, people put like little, you know, a makeshift Craigslist of what they need, that kind of thing. But it's a book that definitely shows its age. It's really not great on gender relations, race relations, but as a sort of manuscript of where you can tell the person was terrified when they wrote this. You can tell that it wasn't a passing concern that they decided to write a novel about. It's a really fascinating work. That one comes to mind. More recently, I love The Power. I thought it was an incredible piece of work, and like an exciting book too. Like it says something, but also just really good read. The End We Start From, which is a book that came out in England. Megan Hunter, a poet. It's her first novel. She's a poet by training, and it's a story about a woman and her newborn in a drowned London. London is underwater, they're trying to get out, and she's struggling to basically escape and care for her child. And it's written in little tiny vignettes, sometimes just a sentence or two. And it infuses all of these prayers from various religions. And it's an incredibly poetic, beautiful book, very unconcerned with the sort of mechanics of world building, doesn't explain how the water got to be this high or any of that. It's very much the emotional resonance of somebody dealing with uncertainty while having a helpless human being that they have to take care of. It's a beautiful book. Didn't get much attention on this side of the planet, but is being made into a TV series in England, I think, so we'll probably get more notice soon. Those ones come to mind. Sorry, I can keep rambling or I can stop.
No, you're giving us all book lists, I'm guessing, from the rapt attention I have. We've lost very few people here, so yeah.
I'll throw one more, and then I'll leave it at that. I brought this up earlier as well. Frankenstein in Baghdad. I brought this up at the workshop earlier. Ahmed Sadawi, an Iraqi writer, wrote a retelling of the original Frankenstein, except this time it's modern day. Frankenstein is in Baghdad, and his limbs are made up of the limbs of victims of sectarian violence, car bombings, and that sort of thing. Sounds like it'll be a really bang bang kind of book. It's very quiet, very ambiguous, very sort of philosophical. Almost everyone I know in this part of the world who's read it has hated it. So please take that with a grain of salt. I loved it, but I'm constantly talking it up because I think it's just a really good book on the cyclical absurdity of war, and does it in a really neat way.
There's just one more question I want to make sure from Victoria. This short story, I'm assuming, is what she's referring to. Does that have a publication date? Is that something that people can read?
The newest one is called The Memory Museum. I'll put it in the chat. It was supposed to come out. It was supposed to come out in Moss, the next issue of Moss Lit magazine.
Thank you.
I changed the names of my stories a lot, so I'm hoping that I haven't changed it since I called it the Memory Museum. I'm pretty sure that's what it's called. But yeah, it was supposed to come out in June, but I think COVID kind of pushed everything back on their production schedule. So soon, I hope.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. And this has been, I think, like I'm seeing this comment, I had the same experience. I just settled back in and was lost in your story. So thank you so much for that. A couple things, just so everybody knows. Next up on your schedule, we'll be doing a craft talk with Ellen Waterston at 2 o'clock in just a few minutes, actually. And then at 4 o'clock, our lovely Laura Pritchett will be back for her reading. I'm going to be logging in on these readings at 10 minutes or so ahead of time. So I welcome you if you want to jump in and have a chance to chat with any of our faculty or with me or with each other, please feel free to jump in early. To that end, today, you may have seen an email about this already. We decided as a staff that one of the things we're missing are these opportunities for us just to interact. So tomorrow and Friday at 5 o'clock, we're going to have basically a little social hour. So there'll be a Zoom meetup where people can just log in and talk, and it's not going to be moderated. It's just going to be a chance for you guys to kind of just get a chance to get to know each other. And we'll just welcome you to participate if you like. So again, thank you for your patience and dedication, and we will see you again in a little bit. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.